that are, in October of 1307, the most powerful military order in the medieval world was torn apart in a single night. Thousands of knights were arrested, tortured, and condemned. Their Grand Master was burned alive, their assets were seized, and officially, according to the Church, according to the Crown, according to the written record, the Knights Templar ceased to exist. The story was over. But here is the question that history has never quite been able to close. What happened to the ones who were never found? Not all of them were caught. Not all of the treasure was recovered. And the fleet of ships reportedly anchored at the French port of La Rochelle simply vanished from the historical record. No wreckage, no cargo, no crew. Gone. Over the centuries that followed, a remarkable set of threads began to surface. A disputed document describing a voyage to an unknown western land, a carved stone in Massachusetts, a chapel in Scotland with carvings that some researchers believe show plants from a continent Europe had not yet officially discovered, and persistent legends of a Templar bloodline, a hidden lineage that survived the purge and carried something forward into the modern world. We know what the official record says happened to the Templars, but the official record has gaps. In this episode, we are going to look very carefully at those gaps. We will be clear about what is confirmed history, what is genuine scholarly debate, and what is legend or speculation. The line between those things matters, and tonight we are going to walk it together. To understand why the Templars refused to disappear from history, you first have to understand what they actually were. The reality is almost as extraordinary as the legend. The Knights Templar were a Catholic military order founded in the early 12th century, in the aftermath of the First Crusade. Their original purpose was straightforward and genuinely dangerous: to protect Christian pilgrims making the long, perilous journey to Jerusalem. A small group of knights took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and stationed themselves along the roads of the Holy Land. That was the beginning. What came next was anything but small. Over the following 2 centuries, the Templars grew into something the medieval world had never quite seen before. They were simultaneously a religious brotherhood, a military force, and a financial institution. They owned land across Europe and the Middle East. They built fortifications. They negotiated with kings. And they pioneered a banking system sophisticated enough that a pilgrim could deposit money in Paris and withdraw the equivalent in Jerusalem, without carrying a single coin across bandit-filled roads. For their era, this was a revolution in finance. At their peak, the Templars operated across multiple kingdoms, answered to no monarch, and answered to the Pope only in theory. That kind of independence made them enormously powerful. It also made them dangerous enemies. The man who decided to act on that danger was King Philip IV of France. On Friday the 13th of October, 1307, a date some historians have suggested may be the origin of the Friday the 13th superstition, though that connection is itself debated. Philip ordered the simultaneous arrest of Templars throughout his kingdom. The charges were severe: heresy, blasphemy, and acts too scandalous to repeat in polite medieval company. Under torture, many knights confessed. Historians are careful to note that confessions extracted under torture tell us very little about what the accused actually did. They served their purpose at the time. The debate about Philip's true motives has never been fully resolved. Some historians emphasize that the French crown owed the Templars a substantial amount of money, that destroying the order was a convenient way to cancel that debt. Others argue that Philip was a genuinely pious man who believed, or convinced himself to believe, that the Templars had become corrupt. Most historians today regard the suppression as driven by a mixture of financial pressure, political calculation, and religious justification, each reinforcing the others. The order was formally dissolved by Pope Clement V at the Council of Vienne in 1312. 2 years later, the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris. According to later accounts that cannot be independently verified, he died proclaiming his innocence and cursing both the king and the pope. Both men were dead within the year. Whether that was coincidence or legend burnishing itself over time, the story proved irresistible, and here is where the official record becomes genuinely interesting. The historical record does not fully account for what happened to the Templar fleet reportedly stationed at the port of La Rochelle on the Atlantic coast of France. Around the time of the arrests, those ships appear to have simply vanished from the documentary record. No wreckage, no cargo inventories seized by the Crown, no crew lists among the arrested. Some credentialed historians have noted this gap as a genuine puzzle, not proof of escape, but an absence that the evidence does not explain. The ships at La Rochelle vanished, and a significant number of Templars themselves were simply never accounted for in the arrest records. So where did they go? That question, unanswered for more than 7 centuries, is where our story truly begins. When the arrests began in October of 1307, the net that King Philip cast across France was wide, but it was not without holes. The question that historians have wrestled with ever since is not simply whether Templars escaped. Some clearly did. The real question is where they went and what they carried with them when they left. 2 destinations stand out above all others, and they stand out for very different reasons. The first is Scotland. This is not merely legend, it is a genuine historical observation made by mainstream scholars. At the time of the Templar suppression, Scotland under Robert the Bruce was in a state of excommunication from the Catholic Church. That single fact is enormously significant. The papal orders commanding the arrest and prosecution of Templars across Europe carried no legal weight in excommunicated territory. Scotland, in effect, existed outside the reach of the very authority that had condemned the order. For a fugitive Templar, it was one of the few places in Christendom where the long arm of Rome could not easily follow. Now, here is where we must be careful and honest. A long-standing popular tradition holds that Templars who reached Scotland went on to fight at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, turning the tide for Robert the Bruce against the English, and were rewarded with permanent sanctuary. It is a compelling story. It is also, according to historians, a legend. No contemporary documentary evidence has been found to place Templar knights on that battlefield. The tradition persists, and it is vivid, but it belongs in the category of legend rather than established history. We note it because it matters to understanding how the Templar myth evolved, but we do not present it as fact. The second destination is Portugal, and here the story moves from legend into documented history. In Portugal, the Templar order was never truly destroyed. Under royal protection, the order was reconstituted under a new name, the Order of Christ. Many former Templars joined this successor organization, which inherited significant Templar assets and, crucially, Templar maritime expertise. This is confirmed history, not theory. What makes this genuinely remarkable is what the Order of Christ did next. In the following century, it became one of the primary sponsors of Portuguese maritime exploration. The age of voyages that would eventually map the coastlines of Africa, open the sea route to India, and reach the Americas. The red cross that flew on those Portuguese sails was the cross of the Order of Christ, the same cross design the Templars had made famous across 2 centuries of crusading. Some researchers argue this creates more than a symbolic connection. They suggest it represents an institutional continuity, that Templar navigational knowledge, accumulated through decades of Mediterranean and Atlantic seafaring, flowed directly into the exploratory voyages of the 15th century. Mainstream historians are cautious here, treating it as a genuinely interesting parallel rather than proof of anything more. The leap from institutional continuity to the claim that Templars possessed secret knowledge of the Americas is, at this point, speculation. We label it as such, but the question it raises refuses to go away. If the Templar Order's direct successor was funding the ships that mapped the world, what did they already know, and who taught them to sail so boldly into the unknown? That question leads us to one of the most intriguing and disputed figures in this entire story, a Scottish Norse nobleman whose name keeps appearing wherever the pre-Columbian mystery runs deepest. A disputed document, a carved stone in Massachusetts, a chapel in Scotland with carvings that some say show plants from a continent Europe hadn't officially discovered yet. Each piece alone proves nothing, but together they form a pattern that is very hard to simply dismiss. Of all the theories connecting the Templars to the New World, one name surfaces more than any other: Henry Sinclair. According to this theory, and it is important to be clear that this is a theory, not established history, Sinclair was a Scottish Norse nobleman who held the title Earl of Orkney in the late 14th century. Some researchers believe he may have led a voyage to the coast of North America around 1398, nearly a full century before Christopher Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean. The primary source for this claim is a document known as the Zeno Narrative. Published in Venice in 1558, it describes a series of voyages undertaken by two Venetian brothers in the late 1300s, allegedly in service of a powerful northern lord referred to as Prince Zikmany. Some researchers have argued that Zikmany is a corrupted rendering of the name Sinclair. If that identification is correct, and if the voyages described are accurate, then the narrative places a Sinclair-led expedition deep into the North Atlantic, potentially as far as the North American coastline. However, mainstream historians are deeply skeptical. Many scholars regard the Zeno narrative as unreliable, at best a heavily embellished account, at worst a partially fabricated one. The identification of Zikmany with Sinclair is disputed, and the document's publication more than a century, a half after the supposed events, makes independent verification nearly impossible. This is not a fringe objection. It is the considered position of the majority of academic historians who have examined the text, yet the theory does not rest on the Zeno narrative alone. Supporters also point to physical evidence, though again, that evidence is genuinely contested. In Westford, Massachusetts, there is a carving on a rock face that some researchers describe as depicting a medieval knight in armor, consistent with 14th century heraldry. Proponents of the Sinclair theory argue this could be a memorial marker left by a Templar-connected expedition. Archaeologists, however, dispute the carving's age and origin, and no consensus has been reached. Then there is the Newport Tower in Rhode Island, a circular stone structure whose origins have fueled debate for generations. Some researchers argue its architectural style predates colonial settlement and reflects medieval European construction techniques. Mainstream archaeology generally attributes it to 17th century colonial builders, though the argument has never been entirely settled to everyone's satisfaction. And then there is Rosslyn Chapel. Built by the Sinclair family in Scotland in the 15th century, it is a structure already heavy with symbolic meaning. Some researchers have pointed to carvings within the chapel that they believe depict plants native to the Americas, most notably what they interpret as maize and aloe. If accurate, this would suggest the Sinclair family possessed knowledge of the New World before Columbus, but botanists and art historians who have studied the carvings disagree. The majority view is that the carvings represent stylized European plants, not New World species, that the interpretation says more about what we want to find than what is actually carved in the stone. So where does that leave us? With a disputed document, a contested carving, a debated tower, and a chapel full of ambiguous stone, no single piece of this puzzle constitutes proof, but the question that lingers, the one that keeps researchers returning to these sites decade after decade, is whether the Sinclair family's deep Templar associations, combined with all of this circumstantial evidence, adds up to something more than coincidence. For now, that question remains genuinely open. So let's say some of them made it. Let's say the ships left La Rochelle, that certain knights found refuge in Scotland or Portugal. A man named Sinclair really did sail west into the unknown. The voyage question, as we have seen, is genuinely unresolved, but it immediately raises a second question, one that has proven even harder to let go of. If some Templars survived, what happened to their descendants? Are there people alive today who carry that lineage forward, knowingly or not? This is where history ends and legend begins, and the line between them is blurrier than most people realize. For most of the 20th century, This question lived quietly at the edges of academic debate. Then, in 2003, Dan Brown published The Da Vinci Code, a work of fiction, and it is important to be clear about that, brought the idea of a sacred Templar bloodline into living rooms and airport lounges around the world. Millions of readers encountered, perhaps for the first time, the notion that the Templars had guarded a lineage of almost unimaginable significance, that their suppression in 1307 was less about heresy and more about silencing what they knew. But Brown did not invent this idea. He drew on an older tradition, most notably a book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail, published in the early 1980s, advanced similar theories about sacred lineage and Templar secrets. Mainstream historians have consistently treated that book as speculative nonfiction rather than scholarly history. The theories it contains are fascinating, but they rest on interpretations of evidence that most professional historians do not accept as conclusive. Now, here is a fact that any honest discussion of Templar bloodlines must confront directly. The Knights Templar were a celibate religious order. Members took formal vows of chastity. This is not disputed. It is documented in the order's own founding rules. Any theory of a direct biological Templar bloodline has to account for that institutional reality. Some researchers respond by suggesting that vows were not always strictly observed, which is plausible given human nature. Remains speculation in the absence of specific documented cases. Others argue that bloodline claims in this context refer not to biological descent at all, but to initiatory or spiritual lineage, a transmission of knowledge and identity rather than genetics. That distinction matters enormously when evaluating what these theories actually claim. At the level of legend, various noble families across Europe, in Scotland, France, and Portugal especially, have at different points in history claimed Templar ancestry or association. Genealogists generally treat these claims as family tradition rather than documented lineage. They are the kind of stories families tell about themselves, and they are very difficult to verify or disprove. Then there are the modern organizations, certain Masonic bodies, neo-chivalric orders, and fraternal societies invoke the Templar name and imagery as part of their identity. Historians are consistent on this point. These groups are modern revivals, not unbroken continuations of the medieval order. The connection is symbolic and cultural, not institutional. At the furthest edge of speculation, some researchers have suggested that advances in genetic genealogy might one day reveal clusters of families sharing unusual ancestry traceable to medieval France or the Crusader states, a kind of genetic fingerprint of Templar survival. It is an intriguing idea, but as of now, no peer-reviewed study has identified anything that could credibly be called a Templar genetic signature, because the Templars did leave descendants, not necessarily biological ones, but institutional ones in banking, in maritime exploration, in the architecture of secret societies, in the very grammar of how we imagine powerful hidden networks, and those descendants shaped the world we live in far more than any bloodline ever could. So here is what we actually know. The Knights Templar were real. Their power was real. Their violent destruction in the early 14th century was real. Some members escaped the purge, that much is documented. The Order of Christ carried their institutional legacy forward in Portugal, and that successor order genuinely did sponsor the maritime voyages that reshaped the world. Those are facts, not legend. Beyond that point, the ground shifts. The fate of the La Rochelle fleet remains a genuine gap in the historical record, not a confirmed escape, but an unanswered question that credentialed historians acknowledge. The degree to which Templar knowledge and networks shaped the Age of Discovery is a matter of ongoing historical debate, not settled consensus. Then there is the layer of theory and legend, the Sinclair voyage, the Westford Night, the Newport Tower, the carvings at Rosslyn Chapel. Each of these claims has been seriously examined, and each has been seriously challenged. None of them, to date, constitutes confirmed evidence of a Templar presence in the Americas before Columbus. And the bloodline question, The idea of secret biological descendants carrying Templar heritage into the modern world remains, to be clear, speculation. Compelling speculation, perhaps, but speculation nonetheless. No peer-reviewed genealogical or genetic study has established a documented Templar bloodline. What the Templars did leave behind is something harder to measure and impossible to erase. A template for the idea of the powerful hidden network, the order that knows more than it reveals, the secret that outlasts the men who kept it. They represent the archetype of the shadowed institution, and human beings are pattern-seeking creatures who find that archetype irresistible. Every generation rediscovers the Templars and asks the same questions because the questions themselves never fully close. The Templars were erased from the official record, but erasure and disappearance are not the same thing, and the marks they left on maps, on stone, on institutions, on the human imagination are still being argued over 7 centuries later. That is the definition of a legacy. If this question fascinates you as much as it fascinates us, subscribe and join the conversation in the comments below. We want to hear which piece of evidence you find most compelling and why. Keep it historical, keep it curious, and we will see you in the next episode. 1-1 No Knock Heroics expected to breathe.